Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us here at the Hoover Institution. I wrote some comments down. I think they're in order. I'm Tim Kane, J.P. Conte Research Fellow in Immigration Studies here at the Hoover Institution and our D.C. office. And I wanted to welcome you, where I have the pleasure of discussing immigration with the renowned Andrew Selee, who's the president of the Migration Policy Institute. We'll be talking about his book, Vanishing Frontiers. Now, I wanted to tell you a little story. I first got this book, I mean literally this book, about 3 or 4 months ago when Mike Frank, who runs the Hoover office, said, Tim, have you seen this book? It's really amazing. And you know, he knows I research and study immigration, and I hadn't seen it. So I've kept this and marked it up and made notes in it, and I opened it again this morning as I was preparing, and the very front page says Mike Frank. So, and it's actually got, this was signed from Andrew to you, which I think I got done at lunch a little while ago.
Oh, right.
I said it was Mike. So I owe you this back, but it's worth a lot more now. Anyway, it really was a delightful book. I think Vanishing Frontiers is the book that you should be reading if you want to understand U.S.-Mexico relations now. It has a great amount of history, but it also talks about this transformation that's gone on in the last 20 years, and just chapter after chapter about investment, not just immigration, about trade, about culture. It's fascinating, it's well written, and it's well done. So I'm excited, Andrew, to hear your talk. Now, let me do an introduction, though, and tell you who Andrew Selee is. His research focuses on migration globally, with a special emphasis on immigration policies in Latin America and the United States. He's the author of several books, including the one we'll discuss today, Vanishing Frontiers, The Forces Driving Mexico and the United States Together. The book was widely and well reviewed in The Economist and the Wall Street Journal and other locations. Andrew's also the adjunct professor at both Johns Hopkins and George Washington University, and was a visiting scholar at El Colegio de Mexico. He holds a PhD in policy studies from the University of Maryland, MA in Latin American studies from UC San Diego, which we hold in common.
That's right, we do.
And he's selected as an Andrew Carnegie Fellow in the 2017-2018 period. So I'm going to ask you to open with about 10 minutes of conversation or discussion of your book, and really the issues that are facing us right now. We're 4 days away from another government shutdown if the U.S. Congress can't come to an agreement on immigration reform. And there seems to be a screamingly obvious compromise that maybe you can see and maybe I can see. And so I'm really curious what your take is on the issue in general and in the context of this. After those 10 minutes, we'll have a little bit of a guided discussion and Q&A, and we'll welcome your questions. So Andrew, welcome.
Well, Tim, thanks for having me here. It's great to be here. It's great to be at Hoover. And we've had a lot of chance to talk about immigration politics. I'm actually punt on the question of immigration politics and come back to that.
Sounds good.
For you and I can go back and forth on that. And I know there's other people in the room that think a lot about this as well, so we should have a good discussion on immigration politics. I wrote this book because Mexico, one is I've spent a lot of time in Mexico and between Mexico and the United States and trying to think about how we're connected as two countries. But it also holds a special place in our discourse and our thinking in the United States. I mean, this is a country that seems to keep popping up. We're about to go into potentially another government shutdown, probably not, but we might, over a border, fence, wall, barrier, call it what you will, on the U.S.-Mexico border, right? I mean, this is, Mexico comes up, NAFTA comes up as an epithet. I mean, it is a constant in our life in the United States. And so I started writing a book about Mexico, and I ended up writing a book about the United States, and about how the United States is connected to Mexico. And I wanted to tell a series of stories that I think add up to a narrative about how we are connected to Mexico in surprising and unusual ways. And so one of the stories, I'm going to tell you a couple stories actually, and just as a starting point, one of the stories has to do with the border. Since President Trump is at the border today and protesters are at the border protesting President Trump, and we're back to border redux again. He's in El Paso, where I was about a month ago. I'm not going to talk about El Paso, but there's a great story about San Diego, because El Paso is actually, for those that have been to El Paso, Texas, El Paso is deeply connected to Ciudad Juarez. The two downtowns are right next to each other. I looked out my hotel window the night I got to El Paso, and there's, Juarez, actually, right? I mean, they're deeply connected. You can move back and forth in a matter of minutes if there's not too much border traffic. San Diego and Tijuana are different, however. And I lived in both Tijuana and San Diego in the mid-1990s for about 7.5 years combined. And they were really different cities. Tijuana was this rough and tumble city. San Diego was this too pretty to be true city. Kind of slightly boring. I'm sorry, is anyone from San Diego, by the way? It's a little a little slightly, you kind of are. It was a little bit on the boring side, but really nice. I mean, really nice city to live in. Tijuana was really fascinating, but a rough and tumble place. And they're physically separate, right? The downtowns are good, even if you don't have border traffic, even if there's no one checking your passport, it's still a good 20 to 30 minutes if you're really hauling it to get from one side to the other. And it's not, San Diego's the one city on the border that does not have the same level of Mexican heritage that the rest of the border does, right? I mean, it does have a large Mexican imprint, but it's not in the same way. It's not majority Mexican descent in any way. And these were very different towns, and I used to think, there's no way that San Diego and Tijuana will ever come together. And the big debate in San Diego was always about what to do with their airport, actually. Everyone knows, everyone's flown into that San Diego airport, it's scary to fly into, right? You're in the middle of downtown and got the Marines on one side, the bay on the other, and all the buildings in downtown. Scary place. And if you want to be San Diego, what happened actually in the last 20 years is San Diego became a city of innovation. San Diego began to think about how they could connect to the rest of the world, not for tourism, which had been San Diego's big industry, but because they were a city of innovation and they needed to be connected primarily to Asia, right, as well as to the rest of the United States and to the rest of the world. And you can't do that with a tiny airport that has one runway and can't take large airplanes. And meanwhile, Tijuana was developing in ways that I would never have predicted in the 1990s. It was becoming a very sophisticated town. Jim, you know Tijuana, becoming a much more sophisticated place that was actually a lot more like San Diego than anyone would have imagined. It was becoming more of a middle-class city, moving into advanced manufacturing. Its industry was becoming very tied into the industry in San Diego. And so increasingly, these were actually similar cities. And somewhere along the way, it occurred to people in San Diego that the best answer for building an airport in San Diego was not to build an airport. It was actually to use the Tijuana airport, which is much larger, which already had flights, has 2 large runways, much longer than San Diego's, already had flights to China and Japan, and was about to have flights to Korea, now has flights to Korea, and is right on the border. And so instead of building a new airport in San Diego, all you had to do was actually build a bridge over the border fence and attach yourself to the Tijuana airport. And that's what they did. Okay, so 3 years ago, they opened a bridge that goes across the border fence. It's a Star Wars looking, I think that's how I describe it. It's sort of like a Star Wars set. And it goes over the regular little border fence down below, and it connects San Diego to the Tijuana airport. And you check in English or Spanish. In what feels like the United States, you park in the U.S. side. You cross the bridge. They very quickly check your passport and check you in customs, but it's actually quite quick. And you go to your gate as though you were in San Diego. And this becomes sort of the ultimate symbol of the two cities connecting themselves. And it set off a set of conversations between San Diego and Tijuana about what else they can do together. And so I have Mayor Faulkner of San Diego in the book talking about how, we don't talk about two cities, we talk about one metro region. Increasingly, they think of themselves as one metro region. And I should say, that Mayor Faulkner is a Republican, right? This is not, this is not sort of a, let's all get together and have a good time, California about California stuff. This is pragmatic thinking about how the two cities are economically connected. So they do a lot of regional planning together. They do a lot of planning in terms. They've actually tried to open a new border port, so they've done a great deal of investment in that. They have Tijuana and Baja California representatives on the Regional Planning Council for San Diego's Council of Governments. It's become a very creative binational metro area. It's actually fascinating. And so when you go there, when we talk about the border in Washington, we tend to be talking about one thing, right? We're talking about a scary place that people are pouring across. When you're actually at the border, people are talking about opportunity. They are scared about some of the same things, by the way. We'll talk about immigration. It's not that there aren't problems, right? And they're actually scared. They're worried about some of the things that come with immigration and organized crime, and then they're really worried about some of the solutions that come out of Washington and Mexico City as well. So, I mean, they get scared both ways on this. But for the most part, they think of each other as partners in trying to move themselves ahead. And, this is driven ultimately by San Diego and Tijuana. San Diego wanting to compete with Los Angeles and San Francisco in the Bay Area, and Tijuana wanting to become a modern city and sort of a first-class city of Mexico. But it turns out the border is everywhere. And so, if you watch the, not the Grammys last night, not much on Mexico there, but if you followed the BAFTAs or if you followed the Golden Globes, if you're going to watch the Oscars, 4 of the last 5 Oscar-winning directors for Best Director are Mexican. Huge. I have a chapter on the film industries in the two countries and how much 4 of the last 5, the favorite going into the next one is also Mexican, right? Is Alfonso Cuarón. Could be 5 out of 6. Something happened between the film industries, between Hollywood and Mexico City and Guadalajara, where the film industry is sort of jointly based, and Hollywood in the United States, that tells you there's a deeper connection that maybe we've missed along the way. And so I try and tease that out in the book about how the film industries actually ended up getting connected. And Hollywood, you could kind of believe. Los Angeles is not that far away. Los Angeles, like San Antonio, is kind of a border city, right? Like Monterrey, Mexico. It's a couple hours away, 3 hours away. But the book actually opens, and with this I'll end. It opens with a story that's much further away, which is actually Hazleton, Pennsylvania. Hazleton, Pennsylvania is actually 2,000 miles. I checked it. Somewhere I have the actual calculations, about 2,000 miles away from the border. It is not a border city by anyone's calculation, and yet I would argue too that almost everywhere in the United States is a border city today. And almost everywhere in Mexico is also a border city, because the relationship has expanded in such a way that while San Diego and Tijuana may be especially intense, there may be something unique about that relationship because of distance. You can't replicate that between Hazleton and Puebla in Mexico, for example, but the ties are almost as deep. And Hazleton's a city, you all remember Hazleton from the headlines back in 2006. It was the first city that had local ordinances that made it illegal to rent to, good to see you, made it illegal to rent to people who couldn't prove their legal status in the United States, or to rent to them or to provide them with a job, and English became the official language of the city of Hazleton. Hazleton is a city that went through an enormous boom of immigration, although most people were actually already in New York, New Jersey area. But people, Mexicans first and later Dominicans, moving in. The city today is about half Latino, not all immigrant. Actually, most of the kids are U.S. born, but immigrant families. A city that went through an enormous demographic change from being an almost white, historically Eastern European, Irish, and Italian background city. And a city that really carries its ethnic heritage on its sleeve, now has a whole other layer of ethnic identity added onto it. And not surprisingly, this would generate enormous pushback, right? It would generate tensions in the community. What got me to go to Hazleton, though, was a fascinating thing that I noticed along the way, which was that there was a Mexican company named Bimbo. Does anyone know what Bimbo is? They make baked goods. Biggest baked good company in the world. Bimbo is, in the United States, it's Entenmann's, it's Sara Lee, it's Oro Wheat, it's Stroman's Amish bread, not so Amish. It's Thomas English muffins, not as British as it used to be. Bimbo is the largest baked goods company in the world, but also in the United States. It's about a quarter of all baked goods that we consume in the United States, fresh baked goods. 2 of their plants are actually in Hazleton. And so that struck me as sort of an interesting story. I mean, here 10 years after, and at that point it wasn't even 10 years, that was in about 2009, I think I started going. There was one plant of Bimbo, and then there was another plant, because they had acquired some companies along the way. I thought, there's a story going on here. Sort of this debate over immigration and sort of human capital flowing across the border, and now suddenly you have financial capital flowing across the border and connecting us in unusual ways. And then I realized along the way, at one point the book opens with the story of a restaurant owner in Hazleton, and I'm in his restaurant, and I'm reading that people are being hired for Mission Tortillas in the town next door, which is also a Mexican company. That's Gruma in Mexico, for those that know Mexico. It's Mission Tortillas. One of the major employers in the city also is Mission Tortillas, another Mexican company. And then Wise Potato Chips, somewhere along the way. We all know Wise Potato Chips, right? I mean, it's an East Coast phenomenon. Wise Potato Chips, the official potato chips of the New York Mets and the Boston Red Sox, also owned by a Mexican company, it turns out. It took me a while to discover this along the way. So and right next to Hazleton, another town that's right next. So 4 of the largest employers in and around Hazleton are actually Mexican companies. Now, this is not to say Mexican companies are taking over the world. I'm not trying to start like a Mexico scare, like a China scare, right? This is sort of, here Mexicans are taking over everything. That is not true either. It's simply to point out how unusual these connections are, right? And it is true when you're at the border that these connections are much more intense and unusual, but it turns out the border is increasingly everywhere we are, even in a place like Hazleton, where historically immigration was incredibly foreign, but it turns out now it's a mixture of immigration, it's a mixture of small businesses, because Hazleton's gone through an incredible economic revival. Actually, it's a beautiful city. I highly recommend it, by the way. Great city. It's gone through an economic revival thanks in part to small business owners who are immigrant, who have moved in, mostly Mexican and Dominican, but increasingly from everywhere, in a city that's really turning itself around in a lot of ways after a long period of decline, after the coal mines closed down. And it's a city that has a lot of investment from Mexico. And so all these unusual connections happen. And so that's why I wrote this book in the end. It does not, that said, and with this I will end because it'll get to your question, it'll get us back into this terrain. I would say the issue of immigration is not a non-issue at the border. If you ask people in San Diego, their solution to immigration is not to build a wall across 2,000 miles of border. But that doesn't mean, you couldn't get a majority opinion for that, but it doesn't mean they aren't concerned about immigration. And if you ask people in Hazleton, you will get very different senses of what to do. Hazleton voted overwhelmingly for President Trump after being a mostly Democratic city. And it largely is seen by politicians on the ground there as a bellwether on immigration, of a real sort of sense of frustration about demographic change and about feeling that even though the city is better off, that perhaps those that have been there a long time have not benefited equally from that. And so it gets us into some of our complicated immigration policy. If you ask people in Hazleton, they would probably say build the wall. Although if you ask Latino voters who are growing in number but are still far behind the numbers, you probably wouldn't get the same reaction. So we get into our complicated immigration politics. So.
Fantastic. Thank you. All right, so I have my first question was investment. Tell us about Bimbo. But
I'll tell you about another company. I'll tell you De Acero.
But, because we do think of the Mexico-U.S. relationship in terms of immigration, and we also think of immigration in terms of U.S.-Mexico. Both are much bigger topics. And that chapter, I think it was chapter 3, was the one about investment. That's the one that grabbed my attention when I knew this book was special and it was different. Can you talk about some of the other trends that you noticed in investment, some of the dollar figures? Like, just thinking of how many baked goods we have is one thing, and maybe even more powerful than data. Because I grew up eating English, Thomas English muffins. My mom was frustrated. We wouldn't eat anything else for a couple of years. So to think now that that's, a Mexican company wanted to invest in that, and there's an investor or a group of investors that believe in America and forging that relationship. I think you get into some of that too, beyond just the shock value. But tell us some more about investment, and maybe whenever you write a book, there are things that are left on the cutting room floor. You just end up editing out some juicy material. What on this economic relationship was left out of the book?
I didn't get to all the cases that I want on the economic relationship. So Borden Milk, for example, is I do actually have an interview with the CEO of Lala, which is Borden Milk in the United States. So a number of our major milk brands are actually owned by a Mexican company. TracFone, the largest prepaid cell phone. Anyone who spent time in Latin America knows a lot of people use prepaid cell phones, right? It is, so, Mexican company, Carlos Slim moves into the U.S. market, think he's going to, start a prepaid cell phone service that will serve basically Mexican immigrants, maybe Latin American immigrants, and finds out there's a bunch of young Americans that really like the idea of a prepaid cell phone. It's all their parents will allow them to do, right? Put a little bit of money on it, that's all you can use for the month, and it takes off. And so the model that came out of Latin America ends up, drinkable yogurt is also a big thing in Latin America, right. Which is becoming a big thing in the United States, but it's been a big thing in Latin America for a long time. So Lala actually gets in using drinkable yogurt, selling to Mexicans, and then figures out it sells to a larger population. And the French in your play were figuring that out at the
Andrew,
same
where
time.
are they selling, though? Are they trying to sell it in boutique, ethnic stores?
It's funny, almost all the Mexican companies that move into the U.S. think they're moving into the Mexican migrant market.
Yeah.
Now, there are a couple exceptions to that. For the most part, they move in, they think we've got a product, we can sell it to migrants, we got our own people on the side of the border, we'll start investing. And then they realize, as one CEO said to me at one point, I don't think I included this because that was an informal conversation a few years ago, he said, we were trying to sell to Mexican migrants and we figured out we couldn't differentiate who we were selling to, right? And so we were selling to a bunch of other Americans, whatever Americans are, right? People sort of, and so we just realized, let's just go into the U.S. market, right? I mean, that's been, Bimbo was the same way. They started off selling with a little plant in California, trying to sell to Mexican migrants. And then realized, if you're going to do that, you might as well go into the full U.S. market.
These are case studies of what we would call foreign direct investment, right? Where you have a company that's making a strategic move. Is it matched by portfolio investment where Mexicans are buying stocks in the U.S. market?
Very much so. In fact, Mexicans invest more in the U.S. market than Americans do in the Mexican market. That's probably not surprising. The U.S. market is a safe bet for Mexicans, right? So it's where a lot of people, but the huge portfolio investment in the U.S. And then some of it is, the story that I was going to tell actually on this is in southeast Missouri, in Poplar Bluff, Missouri, is the largest nail plant in the United States. Nails are an industry that have really gone down. Nails really matter, by the way, because otherwise we'd be out here on 13th Street or New York Avenue having this conversation in the rain, which would be really unfortunate, or we'd have a tent over our heads or something. So nails matter, right? It's one of those things you don't care about until you realize you need one, right? The U.S. nail industry has been really hard hit by mostly Chinese imports, right? Chinese steel, subsidized, coming in, you make nails out of it, put the U.S. nail industry out of business. There's one large company left. There are about 5 or 6 companies left, but there's one large company that's half the U.S. production in Poplar Bluff, Missouri, near our Arkansas border, and it gets its steel from Mexico. So De Acero, a Mexican company, northern Mexico, sends its steel up on a train, and they make nails out of it at the nail plant. 2013, the owner decides to sell it. He's tired of competing. He's done this a long time. He sells it to De Acero. Turns out the largest nail company in the United States is owned by a Mexican company. Mexican steel company none of us have ever heard of. I'd never heard of this story until I was doing the book and someone pointed this out to me along the way. Turns out the U.S. nail industry is saved by a Mexican company, oddly enough. And they've been very successful. They've been somewhat hit by the steel tariffs. There was actually a Washington Post story on this because they have been hit. But here you have Mexican steel, American nails integrated together because NAFTA until the steel tariffs.
And the factory, which has been around for a long time, but the factory would have died. This is a factory in the Ozarks, right?
In the Ozarks, right? Yeah. And they've actually expanded by about a third of the workforce since they bought it. So they've done very well. They contracted a little bit the past year with the steel tariffs, but still over where they were initially. And it tells another truth about Mexican investment in the U.S. and U.S. investment in Mexico, which is largely this is investment, in shared production. Some things are like, we are selling soybeans to Mexico, Mexicans sell strawberries to us. But a lot of the investment that goes on is actually industries where people are making things on both sides of the border. So you have this, the biggest one is cars, right? We all thought at some point cars, the auto industry, for those of us old enough to remember this, the auto industry was going out of business in the 1980s, right? All cars would be imported. Very hard to find an imported car in the United States today. You have to really look hard, unless you count Mexico and Canada as imports. But most Mexican cars that are assembled in Mexico and Canada are mostly U.S. content, right? This is sort of North American content, and most cars in North America are still actually final assembly in the U.S. 57%, I think, is last time I checked, was U.S. assembly. Almost all cars, if anyone's been in a vehicle today, we've all probably been in a vehicle of some kind, it almost certainly has parts from Canada, the United States, and Mexico. And it was made in a seamless, just-in-time manufacturing
You're talking about Toyotas
process.
and Hondas?
Toyotas and Hondas, all the rest. There was a time when we figured everyone would be driving around an imported Toyota. For the most part, if you're driving a Toyota, you're probably driving a Toyota made in North America at this point, or a Nissan, or, But most of the car companies decided to actually make their cars in North America, which is surprising. None of us would have predicted this. Now, it's not just because of NAFTA. It's not just because of Mexico and Canada. It's also because the car companies got smart. There were changes in the law. There are a lot of things happened that we could analyze that go beyond my knowledge base. But part of it was creating this shared production platform in North America. And we've seen this in appliances and other areas where the U.S. would be less competitive if we weren't building across three countries.
So the surprise is that you didn't write this book and then the Trump presidency happened. You wrote this book about how this is almost an inevitable integration, right, between these two societies. And you talk not only about the Trump administration, almost in hindsight, like it's part of what's happening, but the New Mexican president, Obrador, correct? And you say he may not become president. Well, he is. I don't want to get into the politics of it, but I think it's sort of fascinating that you had this all in mind, and yet you still see this overwhelming trend. Let me put on my skeptic's hat, because I like a lot of what you write. I want to believe it's all true, but I can hear, the whispers of family members who maybe don't agree, and there's a part of my brain that thinks, really? Aren't there real problems in Mexico that are maybe intractable? The corruption and the crime, the MS-13 the president talks about a lot. Those are real issues, right? Are you confident that they'll be overcome?
No. I'm confident. I got to writing this, and it was January of 20. It was right around the time of the inauguration. My editor sends me a note and says, "Okay, you've written an entire book saying that the U.S. and Mexico are getting closer. Do you still believe this? You owe me a conclusion." And so I'm writing this in the shadow of the inauguration, saying, "Do I actually still believe this?" And there was a moment. so I had to sit down. I spent a few days thinking about what I was going to do. I said, yeah, I actually still believe this. I mean, and I think we're seeing a natural reaction against a relationship that is becoming intense between the two countries, but also a relationship that does have some real problems. And so let's go to the problems. I mean, I think there really are. This is an asymmetric relationship. So the first thing Mexicans would tell you is, I mean, Mexicans, Jim spent time in Mexico. Mexicans fear this integration also because for them, we are the big neighbor that does not really have their interests at heart, right? We're a bigger neighbor that can demand what we want of them. So a lot of Mexicans are skeptical of this relationship. The U.S. is a global power. They're going to get crushed by us, right? So still there's López Obrador, the new president of Mexico, comes a little bit out of that, right? I mean, he's tempered it as he's become president, but he comes a little bit out of the old sort of leftist view of the United States that this is a dangerous neighbor next door. Don't get too close because they'll eat you up, right? And that is real sense of Mexicans. Mexico's got its own set of problems. I mean, some of them has to do with asymmetric economies. One of the stories in the book with De Acero, I'll tell you the other side of the nail plant story. When the CEO of De Acero comes for his first meeting with the workers at the nail plant company, he finds a bunch of guys who are a lot larger than him. I can't remember exactly how he put it there, slightly more politically correct, but not really politically correct. But, a bunch of guys who could, take him on pretty easily, and he is a sort of, short Mexican executive looking out at them, telling them he's taken over the company and he's looking forward to them working together, and they're all thinking he's going to pink slip us and move this company to Mexico, right? And they think that not because they're a bunch of xenophobes, but because they just moved the air conditioning plant down across the, literally across the same industrial park to Mexico, and they moved it to exactly the same place where the steel plant is, to Saltillo, Coahuila. So I mean, they have every reason in the world to believe that that's about what he's about to do. He bought this plant, and he's about, he's going to keep it going just long enough to actually move it to Mexico. I can tell you there's a lot of evidence out there, and it's in the book, when companies invest in Mexico, U.S. companies invest in Mexico, they almost always invest in the United States on average. I mean, people tend to be expanding operations on both sides, but we don't live in the average, right? If you worked in the nail plant, you did pretty well. You came out well from that average. If you worked in the air conditioning plant, the average does nothing for you because you lost your job, right? And there was a lot of restructuring around NAFTA, and there was a lot of restructuring. People did move things to Mexico.
Yeah.
And by the way, Mexican companies got put out of business by bigger U.S. companies. The things Mexicans were concerned about, right, is that, U.S. companies are going to come in and be able to outcompete them. Well, that happened too. So Mexicans lost their jobs, and Americans lost their jobs. I actually have a story in here which ends up being a good news story, but it starts out as a pretty bad one, with a clothing company in Chihuahua on the Mexican side that gets put out of business. This is a historical company in the city of Chihuahua, gets put out of business because they can't compete. And that's actually with Asian imports, but it's in the context of the World Trade Organization. They get put out of business. They end up finding a niche in the aerospace industry. They end up actually sewing the cushions and all the interiors that go into aerospace. Chihuahua's a big aerospace center. And so they reinvent themselves as an aerospace company. And so there's a fun interview with the CEO, there's two brothers, how they kind of rediscover that you can actually sew for other things, right? And it works out. But there's a lot of disruption that happens. The second thing in Mexico, in terms of asymmetry, is obviously corruption and crime, right? I mean, Mexico has, every time there's a negotiation between the U.S. and Mexican governments on anything, the people walk away, have a great conversation, agree on something. The Mexicans walk away thinking the U.S. is going to roll us on this in the end because because they're the stronger government, right? We've agreed to this, but they're going to ask for this in the end. And the Americans walk away going, I know they have all the best intentions of implementing this, but their capacity to actually do it is limited, right? I mean, yes, they want to do it. We trust them, but they're not going to be able to do it. And it's true, right? I mean, the capacity of the Mexican government to implement anything, if you get into security issues, the capacity to do things on rule of law that don't get corrupted along the way because someone pays a bribe or because someone in the cartel finds out about it ahead of time is limited, right? It's changing. It's getting better. I have a couple chapters on security cooperation where you can see there's actually some progress going forward, but it's always 2 steps forward and 1 step back, right? I mean, there's a lot of cooperation. There's a lot of ways the U.S. and Mexico have found to actually work together on really tricky issues, but it's never uncomplicated, and people are never certain that it's going to start. It starts off actually with an FBI agent who I spent a lot of time with, Eric Dickerson, fascinating guy who at the time was the border liaison. Now he's actually just retired as the overall FBI liaison in Mexico City. But his story is incredible stories of cooperating with Mexican police officers, including what we opened the chapter with, which is a kidnapping that's successful. We're working across the border. But at the same time, he admits his closest friend in Mexican law enforcement turns out to be completely corrupt. And he's actually on a wiretap listening at one point where his friend's voice comes on. And this is the guy he's trusted. I toned it down a little bit in the book, but when I first talked to him, he really, this was clearly someone he had he had spent time with. He got to dinner, and they knew each other's families. Yeah. And then he's on the wiretap, and turns out the guy's working for one of the crime groups. And until that gets solved on the Mexican side, it's unlikely that we will ever have the same kind of trust level going on. Yeah. But also until Mexico feels that they have the same kind of leverage, or at least something approaching. No country has the same leverage as the U.S., but more leverage than they do right now. It's going to also be hard.
The immigration debate is often framed in terms of a worry that Mexicans are immigrating and are going to steal U.S. jobs. I think you do a great job of providing sort of a bigger depth to that. Borjas's book, We Wanted Workers. It's like, we wanted workers, and we ended up getting all these other issues. And I thought, well, wait, that's the wrong way to think about it. If they're only coming as workers and they're taking jobs, that's a bad deal. But if they're actually participating in the community and investing and buying homes, talk about Hazleton, all those homes that are being purchased by immigrants are enhancing the overall home values. So it is this more complicated picture. So I wanted to ask you, though, you moved in to Tijuana in 1992, and you say throughout the book, there's a theme I thought it was fascinating, that this integration, quote, would have been unimaginable 2 decades ago. What changed?
A lot of, I think we became more interdependent and we became more like each other. And those are two different things. The interdependence is what I was talking about. In fact, we really, our economies are tied. Our cinema industry is tied. We eat a lot of the same stuff Mexicans do. There's a bit on food there, which was fun to write, actually, right? And Mexicans eat more like us, too, by the way. So, there's a lot of that interdependence, but we're also like each other. I think maybe the food falls into that, but we're also like each other, which is Mexico's become more middle class. And in some ways, we had a meeting, my colleague Sarah Pierce is here. We had an MPI meeting with a couple of us who were in Mexico. We organized with the Mexican Institution to talk about, and you were with us for a while as well on Skype, where we were talking about migration. And one of the things we realized, this is the first time I've ever realized this in a migration meeting between Mexicans and Americans, is how much we were dealing with the same set of issues. And this was not true 5 years ago or probably even 3 years ago. And this is because so few Mexicans are migrating across the border illegally anymore, right? This is, in the month of December, there were more Guatemalans and Hondurans caught at the border than Mexicans.
Is it net negative?
It's net negative, right? Overall, the number of Mexicans unauthorized in the United States is going down, right? And has been going down, slowly for about 10 years. So, that since about 2009, sort of stabilized in 2007, started going down to 2009. But actually, just even the number, but it was going down because a lot of Mexicans were leaving and a lot of Mexicans were being deported. At this point, there aren't even a lot coming. And we don't actually know the numbers from last year yet, but what we do know is in December, because the CBP told us that there were actually more Guatemalans and Hondurans apprehended at the border. That would have been crazy talk if we had said that 5 or 10 years ago. Mexico's just a bigger country. It's next door. Guatemala and Honduras are small countries far away. Yeah. But there are just fewer, and there still are Mexicans coming across the border illegally. But Mexicans are trying to figure out what to do with Central Americans, right? As we're sitting in this meeting, the Mexicans are trying to figure out what to do with all the Central Americans, right? Should we document them? Should we deport them? And they're moving towards trying to document them at the border or in their home countries. It turns out, oddly enough, is working because some of them are staying in Mexico, which means then what do you do with them once they're in Mexico? And how do you give them jobs? And, how do they get in the labor market? And where do they move to? And do you really want them in the South where there's, where it's pretty poor? Or do you want them up in the North where there are more jobs? And how do you actually make that happen? What do you do with your asylum system that's broken down? Sounds familiar, right? What do you do with your asylum system? What do you do with all these foreigners who don't speak Spanish? By the way, Mexico has somewhere between, depending on who you believe, somewhere between 700,000 and almost 2 million Americans living in Mexico. Us, we're the biggest immigrant group in Mexico. The biggest part of that group is, at least official number, is 550,000 American-born kids under the age of 18. There are places, 2% of Mexico's educational system is U.S.-born, of elementary and middle school education. You go to parts of Mexico and it's 10 to 15%, right? If you go to migrant sending areas where people return, because these are mostly, there's a lot of retirees. There are a lot of retirees. There's a lot of people doing independent businesses, and they're on their computers at a WeWork site, Skyping into, someplace in Philadelphia. You got people in multinational companies. But the biggest number are actually people who came back with their Mexican
We're secretly
parents.
in Baja right now.
Right, exactly. I've done a fair amount of that, actually. They think I'm at the office, but I'm actually sitting on a beach somewhere.
So wait, I got to ask you to repeat that.
Yeah.
2% of the entire elementary school population in Mexico
is U.S. born.
Are U.S. citizens.
Are U.S. citizens. And Mexicans forget about this because they mostly have at least one Mexican parent. And so they kind of fit into schools. I mean, people assume they're Mexicans, right? And they probably do speak Spanish, they speak home Spanish, right? But they've never studied in Spanish before. They've never done math in Spanish. They've never written an essay in Spanish before. And so you have a bunch of kids who are dealing with a lot of, and in many cases, by the way, they've just moved from Los Angeles to some small town in Michoacan or Jalisco, which looks nothing like the Los Angeles neighborhood they grew up in. And so, I mean, they're dealing with a huge culture shock. They have a lot of same integration issues that Mexican kids do in the United States. And so, Mexico is actually dealing with this. Now they're thinking about Central Americans, right? Assuming these Central Americans are really staying, and we think some of them are, they're going to have to deal with Salvadorans and Hondurans who, yes, speak Spanish, but they think they speak it funny, but they speak Spanish, right? And they, of course, the Salvadorans and Hondurans think the Mexicans speak funny. But we have to get them into, they've never learned Mexican history, right? I mean, we have to get them into the Mexican school system. But the big issue are all these kids of Americans that have come back. And it turns out they're dealing with a lot of the same integration issues. So we sat through this, we spent 2 days together sitting through this, checking through boxes, realizing fix the asylum system. What's your legal visa policy? How do you do repatriation, in a way that respects human rights and is humane, but you got to do it. What are your controls? How do you deal with integration in the school system? How do you deal with labor force issues, and where's their competition? Where isn't there competition? Where should you actually encourage people to come in on work visas? Where shouldn't you? And it turns out we were saying exactly the same things.
Right.
Now, there's some differences. Mexico's got 11 million people in the United States, right? We've got, 1 million to 2 million in Mexico, maybe. And the 1 million to 2 million of Americans in Mexico are better off overall. Even the ones who are Mexican parents tend to be overall better off, than the 11 million here. So it's a different set of diaspora issues we're dealing with. But overall, turns out we're having a lot of the same conversations, and we're really trying to figure out what to do with the Central Americans these days, too, which we can talk about more, because that's the issue on which we're about to close the government again.
Well, I do want to, ask. We got plenty of time for questions. So my last question will be: let's talk about politics. Yeah. Talk about what's happening a couple miles up the road, Pennsylvania Avenue. There was this 35-day government shutdown. The president has demanded $5 billion, 5.7 for a wall. And Nancy Pelosi, the new Speaker of the House, has said, absolutely not, it's immoral. So they're in their corners. And I have an instinctive sense, and I've done some polling, that Americans are frustrated that politicians just fight about this. Michael Porter did a study, famous business writer, that this is a signature issue where you can do virtue signaling, and you actually do better off in the polls if you don't compromise. What's it going to take, or what's it going to take, Andrew, in your perspective? What's the right thing to do from a policy perspective, and what's the pragmatic thing to do from a political perspective, where the U.S. can come to a compromise and deal with, this is actually an old issue, illegal immigration, deal with DACA kids, deal with border wall. You've seen a wall in San Diego go up, and yet good walls make good neighbors. Things have worked. Yeah. So what's the compromise? Do you have hope for one?
No, I actually do. I think we can make some baby steps in the next few years, and maybe that leads.
We got 4 days.
Well, yeah. I think the next few days, actually. How about that? I think we can take some very tiny baby steps in the next 4 days. Some bigger, but still maybe toddler steps in the next couple of years, and then maybe we get to, preteen steps at some place, maybe even teenager steps along the way. I think we're dealing with an issue that's become symbolic, right? And it's pulled away from the realm of being rational. I mean, there is no way that a rational mind, there's no rational argument that the number one priority in the United States is building a 2,000-mile wall. It's not 2,000, we got 600 miles of it. So 1,400-mile wall across the border with Mexico. There are places where that's impractical. On the other hand, there's also no rational way of saying that no border wall makes any sense whatsoever, because we've seen examples in San Diego and El Paso, are two of them, where border fences actually helped. right? And the president is wrong when he says that it dropped crime. It didn't. Crime was very low in El Paso, but it did help people's sense of security. And same thing in San Diego. It didn't stop crime because for the most part immigrants aren't committing crimes. But it did stop. But it did help with people's sense of security because having people running through your neighborhood, and other folks chasing after them made people feel insecure, right? And it was probably not good policy. So there are places where fences help, right? There are places where walls, fences, barriers, whatever you call it. So we've gotten into a place where it's either immoral or it's absolutely necessary, and both of those positions are crazy, right? With all due respect to the Speaker of the House and the President of the United States. But they're doing it because they're signaling for the reason, they're signaling to their constituencies, their base constituencies, right? I mean, there is somewhere in the middle, and you've written about this. I see Bill Galston back there. I mean, a lot of us have tried writing about this. There is a medium position where we can figure out what the basket of things we need to do are, right? Maybe border security and DACA and TPS is a good place to start. I don't think they're going to end up doing that, but that seemed like a good place to go. Give Trump a little more, actually, of what he wanted in border security, but get something done on DACA and TPS, and then start looking at other sort of pairings that work along the way. But the set of issues we got to figure out is in our national interest, not because we want to be good to immigrants, right? We should treat immigrants fairly. We should treat immigrants with respect and with respect for human rights. But immigration policy is not about immigrants, right? Immigration policy is about national interest. So we want to, but we do need a labor force, right? We're at a time where it turns out we need people high skilled, but we also need some people middle skilled and low skilled. Let's figure out what areas of the economy there are. Let's figure out what the numbers are. Let's figure out if we've gotten to a number of people coming in that is in and of itself scaring people, or we're at the right number, or we need a little bit more. That's a real debate to have. Let's figure out how we fix our asylum system, something our colleague Doris Meisner has written about extensively. There's a real easy way to fix our asylum system, which I could spend the next 20 minutes talking about, but I'm not going to. No, but it's really easy. I mean, you simply allow asylum officers to make the first level decisions, and then you use the courts as an appeals process. It's a lot easier than trying to increase the number of judges and send everything to the courts. Right. But there's ways Republicans, it dissuades people who don't have a claim. It speeds it up for people who do. Let's figure out then what we do in terms of enforcement. What do we invest in worksite enforcement versus what we invest in border enforcement, border including airports and seaports. These are sort of a set of conversations we should be, and then what do we do about the people that are already here, right? And and do you start with small numbers you can pick off? There are creative ways of doing this. TPS and DACA are one set of people that.
But you don't think it will be done in one bill?
I don't think so.
Yeah.
I don't think.
Right.
There's also people who are spouses of Americans who have 3 and 5 year bars and 10-year bars. 3 and 10-year bars. And those are the sort of things we could actually. You could pick off pieces where you begin to deal with a more manageable universe of issues down the road and leave some of the tough things out there. But I don't think it's going to happen in one fell swoop right now.
Good. Thank you. Well. I've got us with about a little more than 15 minutes and wanted to invite questions from you all on any of these topics. So raise your hand, please, and I'll give you a chance.
Andrew, your book talks a lot of vested interests in the relationship. Car companies, companies in private sector, NGOs, research, and so on. Why are not those voices, and some of them are quite powerful, some of them are GM and Ford and other people, why are not those voices dominating or even really there as clear voices in this debate as we have it in the national level right now? It appears to be that the only voices are the ones that are fearful, hateful about the issue of immigration. Where are these vested interests in this discussion?
I think a lot of them are there. I mean, I think part of why the new NAFTA, if it ever gets passed, looks so much like the old NAFTA is, and by the way, every winning presidential candidate, it's probably wrong because not Bush, but both Obama and certainly Trump ran on the desire to change NAFTA, right? Obama ran on this too, right? I mean, he backed away from it pretty quickly. Trump didn't back away from it, but everyone's wanted to get rid of NAFTA. Part of why they didn't trash NAFTA in the end is there were so many interests on both sides of the border that actually were doing well. And the car companies starting with it, right? I mean, we're saying but also farmers, right? I mean, farmers were a huge constituency, in this, and saying, look, if you try and completely undermine this, I mean, the integration that's gone on between our countries is now part of our business model. we could fix some parts about this, but don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And so I think they've been important in the specific debates. I think they've been important in shooting down bad ideas on immigration. I think it's part of why we have a stalemate. Vested interests aren't always as good at making things move forward, though. And they tend to be timid on that because they have lots of issues, particularly in the business community. They have lots of issues at stake all the time. So, you don't necessarily want to get out completely on one of them when you're also talking about taxes and regulation and other things. But the other thing going on, there's a lot of fascinating poll. There's a Chicago poll that I cite at the end of this that shows young people have entirely different appreciation, both of immigrants but also of Mexican. And they're different polls, on this, actually. If you break it down by age, there's more polling on immigration than there is on Mexico. Chicago poll is on Mexico, but there's a number of ones on immigration. People just have a different appreciation. We're in a more interconnected world. People who've grown up in that have a different sense, which doesn't mean, by the way, we shouldn't assume that means that because people have a different sense of Mexico or a different sense of immigrants, they will necessarily line up behind a particular political position, but they will line up behind whatever political position they do with great respect, right? Which is a different thing, right? It is with less fear, right? I think sometimes the fear, and I say both Mexican immigrants because these are topics that have become entwined. Despite the fact that we have very little Mexican immigration overall,
right.
And if you add in legal immigration, which is most Mexican immigrants actually behind Chinese and Indian immigration these days, right? Mexico's, but it is entwined in our minds, right? When we talk about immigration, we're talking about undocumented Mexicans.
Yeah.
So, as a Salvadoran friend of mine said recently, I walk down the street and everyone assumes I'm a Mexican, right? This is sort of the way our debate has been framed in the United States. There is a generational change happening, and that is Alfonso Cuarón. It's all the filmmakers. It is Mexican food. It is, the fact, by the way, the NBA, the NFL, and Major League Baseball all play games in Mexico. I didn't realize this till I was I'm writing a book about integration between Mexican years. I didn't realize this till I was at the end of the book, that actually Major League, I knew NFL, but actually NBA and Major League Baseball very quietly have started playing games every season in Mexico. We just have a kind of integration going on that is, for people who are a little younger than me, is really natural.
Yeah.
And in terms of diversity of the country is natural. Now, it doesn't mean everyone's suddenly going to line up behind Nancy Pelosi on political positions. I think it means it'll change the nature of the debate in this country.
Yeah. My name's Carl Pulzer, and I have a project called the Center on Capital and Social Equity, and it explores inequality in America, and also I advocate for the lower half, the people left out. And so I'm very interested, I can't wait to read your book. It's been fabulous. But I'm very interested in the point that there aren't that many Mexicans coming in and the impact of NAFTA and the integration, and the nature of the integration and the class structure. In that, is it because Mexicans can find a better industrial job at home? And, and so they get better wages, and the U.S. isn't experiencing kind of the same thing that Branko Milanovic kind of paints between the U.S. and China, and that Chinese middle class emerges, the U.S. working class loses, at least the middle, the industrial part of it. And the other thing is, on the low-wage worker side, I have a vested interest in a family member who has a mental disability, is kind of surly. And he's in the workforce, and I can see, just from his various jobs, how having competent illegals around would knock him out of a job.
Yeah.
So, it's reality.
Yeah.
So just some observations, but I think it's how it's affected the industrial jobs and the low-wage jobs that's fueled a lot of what Trump is doing, but he doesn't really express it directly. Does that make sense?
That makes a lot of sense.
What are you saying?
But, by the way, I would say one thing we should actually get straight on our immigration is none of us should actually want illegal immigration. Right? I think that's become a bit of a talking point. Now, we can go about it. That doesn't mean we should demonize people who are here unauthorized. We want to bring people out of the shadows who have integrated into American society. I think there's lots of reasons. But we should want a legal population, right? We should want to figure out how we can...
We should want a legal population.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, we should want a legal population. I mean, we should want, and this should, Democrats and Republicans should agree on this, right? I mean, on both sides of this, which is we should want border security and worksite enforcement that discourages illegal immigration and asylum provisions and so on that discourage illegal immigration. And at the same time, we should also want to take people who are well integrated in the labor market in their communities and make sure if they're here illegally and they're likely to stay here illegally, we should want them in the legal economy because the competition becomes more fair, right? I mean, that is, and I just got off a call on something completely different, a radio show in Venezuela. Technology in Venezuela is hard, by the way, to do a radio show. But Venezuelans, we just did a report actually on Venezuelans moving, almost 2.5 million Venezuelans have moved into the rest of Latin America in the past couple of years. And most of the countries are opting to put people, finding ways, Michael Burnham, good to see you, to find ways of legalizing people's status, at least temporarily. And why are they doing it? Because they don't want the kind of competition that comes. They want people undercutting wages, right? I mean, that's their number one thing, is they'd rather have, they can't stop people from coming in their case because they know they don't have the kind of border security that can even minimally stop people from coming. They can't even try and do that. So they said, but at least let's legalize people and have some fair competition. So, which is fascinating. I see countries like Colombia and Peru and Argentina going out of their way to like bring people out of the shadows up front. The other part of so that was the second part. The first part was the important part, sorry. I like to say on this, I mean, it's not that there's no effects. I think there is. I mean, the refrigerator factory in Poplar Bluff is a place to be in. I mean, it clearly replaces are companies that have moved from the U.S. to Mexico and companies in Mexico that went under, like the clothing factory. But at the same time, what we have with Mexico and Canada is much more, we are the same economy where we actually compete with China. We actually, somewhere around, it depends the number you use, but somewhere about half the trade, what we call trade between Mexico and the U.S., is actually intra-industry trade, where we're actually making things together. So we really are an integrated economy. It's a different sort of equation. Getting there was painful, right? And there still is some pain that comes with it, but most of the pain is behind us at this point because we are a single economy.
American Enterprise
Great to
Institute,
see you, Michael.
Washington Examiner.
One of the
So
people I've admired for years.
Octavio Paz is now obsolete. Mexico is not a totally different civilization. I get a sense that northern Mexico and southern Mexico are almost two different countries. There's sort of cultural and economic divide that's like America in the 1940s or 50s, more than the United States of today. Are Oaxaca and Chiapas never going to advance to Guanajuato and Nuevo Leon?
It's a great question. For anyone who doesn't know, Michael, longtime editor of the Almanac of American Politics, which was my Christmas gift for years as I was a teenager, as you know. So I was the geeky high schooler who used to ask for this.
This was the intended audience.
Yes. And look what you did to me, Michael.
Nerdy teenagers.
That was the mean Santa Claus, by the way.
That was exactly, yes. My sister was getting all sorts of beautiful clothes. I was getting all, no, it was great, actually. I loved it. I grew up on it. I think it's a great point. And it's actually one of the things I realized when I wrote the book that I didn't wrestle with enough, is sort of the differences both within Mexico and within the United States on this. But particularly in Mexico. And López Obrador is partially a reaction to this in Mexico. The president comes in promising to, bring southern Mexico along. I think that's true. Northern and central Mexico are really integrated with the U.S. and with the global economy in general. Southern Mexico is not, right? It's still rural, it's still agricultural, it's still poor, it's still, the exception of Yucatan, which is really connected to the Caribbean and to the United States through New Orleans. Has actually been really, and it's majority indigenous, or about 45% indigenous state in Mexico, but it actually is incredibly prosperous these days. I mean, it's sort of the exception to every other place in southern Mexico that figured out how to integrate, even having similar demographics and similar sort of political history. Although a bit the political history.
Well, they had their own civil war
against
Mexico
war,
in the 1840s.
And that explains a lot of the difference. They actually did have a sort of pushback and a certain amount of autonomy. One of the things I was explaining, two of the most dangerous cities in Mexico. My wife is from the city of Chilpancingo, Guerrero, which is in the south. It's one of the poorest cities in Mexico. I spent a long time living in Tijuana, Mexico. Both are among the three most dangerous cities in Mexico if you look at the crime statistics. I would have no problem walking out on the streets in Tijuana at night. I would have no problem inviting someone. I would take my family to Tijuana in a minute because, yes, there's a lot of homicides, but it's largely among traffickers themselves, which is not to say that's not, I mean, it's still tragic, but the police kind of work, the courts kind of work. The traffickers know that they don't anymore than they used to, by the way. There used to be a lot of violence in the street in Tijuana. And by the way, there is still some people kidnapped here and there, but it's not, you don't have the same kind of extortion and kidnapping and people being killed in the streets and strung up on bridges that you did 10 years ago in Tijuana, or even 7 years ago, because police have started to kind of work. This is northern Mexico, integrated with San Diego, so, you know, big middle class, pushed back heavily to make police work and make the courts work. Not perfect. You know, would I necessarily become close friends with a police officer on day one? You know, I might hold my wallet, but, you know, nonetheless, you know, they sort of work. Chilpancingo, we try not to go to, okay, even though we have family there, because it is simply with family, because the homicide rates are predatory, right? The homicide rates talk about a kind of predatory crime that is extortion, kidnapping, you know, whatever you want, local, just local robbery, because there is no sense of rule of law. You know, and this is, it's a different kind of state presence and a different kind of state strength.
To that question, though, is the South developing? It may be uneven, but is the prosperity across Mexico, is it happening everywhere, and it will just be a matter of time before the South catches up, or is there a divergence?
It's gotten better in terms of education, healthcare, infrastructure, life expectancy in the South, but there's a gap that's emerged. So it's getting better a lot faster in the North and the center.
Okay.
So it might catch up, but it would take a really, really long time.
Okay, great. Well, I think we have time for one more question.
I wish you could get some people in the White House to read your book. It might be open a few eyes. One thing I want to talk to you about, though, is what I think is the root of some of the anti-immigrant sentiment in the United States. And you mentioned Hazleton, Pennsylvania, and it's a perfect example because it was one of the cities where language became a big issue. And for those of you who don't know, I was at one time president of U.S. English, which
I didn't know that.
And quit when I discovered that they were involved in some things that I considered, quite frankly, racist. But the whole question of assimilation, I think, drives a lot of the animus. And what I have found in talking particularly to conservatives is if you talk to people in places where there is a vibrant immigrant community and the kids are growing up and they're going to school and they're learning English and they're becoming very Americanized going on to college, there's a very different attitude than in places where they have no immigrants or where the immigrants are brand new and are continuing to come in low-wage jobs. And there is a sense, I think, of anxiety on the part of the communities like those in Hazleton, Pennsylvania, most of them immigrant communities themselves from a couple of generations ago. How is it that we try to bridge this and try to get people more comfortable with the idea that, in fact, Hispanics are doing what every other generation of immigrants have done, and that is learn English, get more education, and move into the middle class? How is it we do a better job of getting that story out? Because I think that is at the root of a lot of the anxiety.
It's hard to tell. And by the way, I have to say I have some sympathy for people in Hazleton, for native-born residents that had to deal with things like suddenly, having to find Spanish language teachers and people who could speak Spanish in emergency. I mean, there are costs that come with immigration initially, right? I mean, so, there are actually costs that happen up front, even though if you look at Hazleton 10 years later, things turned out pretty well, actually, right? I mean, overall, the entrepreneurial spirit, because immigrants are about twice as likely as native-born Americans to start a business. So the entrepreneurial spirit actually ends up being kind of what leads off now, but 10 years ago it was like, how are we going to deal with the schools when the parents don't speak English, right? I mean, you sort of get there. I think we're about to find out. I think what has made this hard in part is that we've had a constant replenishment of immigration from Latin America. Right, and so even though you do have a fair amount of actual integration going on, people in corporation, people moving up into the middle class, very few third generation, Mexicans or Central Americans or South Americans speak Spanish well, right? I mean, families are struggling to keep their children speaking some Spanish, right? I mean, so they can talk to abuela, right? I mean, but very little. And by the way, one of the fun interviews in the book is with Univision, one of the anchors for Univision, who talks about the fact Univision is actually worried about the fact that they're not going to have a market down the road, right? Because they're trying to figure out how to deal with, how can they actually deal with an English-speaking Latino market, because they realize there aren't going to be a lot of Spanish speakers down the road. So, if yes, they're at their zenith right now, but they know 20 years from now, and certainly 40 years from now, they're not going to be there. I think we're about to find out, because I think the narrative has always been driven, again, it's the Mexican undocumented immigrant, right? That is when we say immigrant, we are half the time, that is what we mean, right? We don't mean, any of the other many, many immigrants in the United States. We're really reducing it to about, what would that be, about 12% of the immigrant population? We're really looking at that. We're talking about this group and not every other group here. There's going to be less and less of that, right? And I think it means that there are going to be fewer Spanish-speaking neighborhoods. I think it means there are going to be fewer people who actually speak Spanish fluently. And some of that is sad, right? As a parent who's trying to make sure that his daughter, well, actually all my kids speak Spanish fluently, but particularly my older daughter doesn't lose Spanish in an overwhelmingly English-speaking environment. But that becomes then the next challenge, right? People want to keep their children speaking the language that connects them back to their heritage. My wife really wants to make sure that happens, right? But that is going to be the next challenge, because I think increasingly we're not going to have, we're getting to that point and we can't see it, because obviously immigration overall is at a high point. And we still are at a moment where immigration debates at the border seem to dominate the conversation. But if you look at real demographics, 20 years from now, that's not going to be the profile of immigrants.
Right.
One of the things our colleagues came up with, Michael Fix and Jenna Badalova, came up with, which I thought was really fascinating, is we looked at the last 5 years. And I say we, it is them, not us, but we get to take credit for it, but as MPI, but it's their work. The last 5 years of immigration, we find out actually about 48% of immigrants have college degrees. More versus about 34% of native-born Americans. Turns out recent immigrants are actually more educated. Now, that is not as true when you look at Mexican Central American immigrants. It is true of South American immigrants. It's not true as Mexican Central American, but even Mexicans are up around 20% now. So, which is a huge, went from about 8 to about 20%. So, there's a huge change in the immigrant population. There's just going to be fewer immigrants from Latin America.
I think, thank you, Andrew. I think that question of demographics is one that I wanted to ask, but ran out of time, turned over to you guys, so I'm glad you came back to it. I think demographics is what's going to make a book that people read now and go, wow, this is so innovative, I hadn't thought about Vanishing Frontiers. The impact of those demographics means 10 years from now, people will say, well, yeah, we all knew this was right.
Yeah.
Right? So it's already happening. I think you caught the tiger by the tail. Really delighted to have you here at the Hoover Institution. Please join me in thanking Andrew Selee for being here today.
Thanks for having me.